Good morning, everyone, to another challenge briefing session. And I think everyone there who's here is well aware that these briefing sessions are to support the young participants in developing proposals to go in at the end of August. This is the fifth briefing session on thinking like a system. And I am giving this morning and we'll be sharing my screen. Do remember that you can expand your screen to fill the whole, expand one of the screens with my presentation to fill the whole screen if you so wish. So I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. One moment. Right, I think that should be okay. I just want to do it. So I'm actually looking at the presentation, thinking like a system. So what I'm going to cover is why should we bother with system thinking? And then what is system thinking compared to what standard, normal, common thinking? And then link that to changing systems and collective intelligence and action. So why systems thinking? I quite like this cartoon that if you don't think about the whole system, it does you in, or it does other people in. Basically, things are linked to other things and you can end up with unexpected implications, though obviously this looks pretty expected, but then people can quite easily miss the obvious. And if you take this example, for instance, rubbish, you might think the solution to this, if you don't think about the system, is picking up the rubbish. But of course, actually, the problem with most of this rubbish is not due to what you see on the beach, but it's actually all the rubbish in the ocean affecting wildlife. And of course, how it got there, if you just removed it, of course, it would just come back. And so understanding how it got to be there in the first place is key for trying to tackle it. This is the best known example of how unintended consequences arise if you don't think about the system. This was an attempt on an island, I can't remember exactly where it was, to get rid of the cobras that were biting people and poisoning people. So the government in question provided incentives to people to kill the snakes, and if they brought in a dead snake, they'd get a payment. Of course, they hadn't thought then how that incentive might play out, in that, of course, people say, well, okay, if I bring in a dead snake, then I get some money, so I will start breeding cobras. So breeding farms of cobras were put up, that were developed. The cobras were then killed and brought in, and of course, the cobras escaped from the breeding farms as well. So the end result was actually more cobras, not less. And actually, that is quite typical. Quite often, people talk about getting the incentives right, and incentives are a classic sort of simplistic sort of causality. I pay for something and it happened. When actually, if people are trying to get the incentive, of course, they can play all sorts of games in order to get the money with the least amount of effort. So whether you'll get the outcome that you were looking for or not is quite uncertain. Of course, where system thinking comes in depends on the nature of the challenge, and something very simple, like following a recipe or following a set of instructions, building a shed, anything like that. Obviously, you don't have to think about the wider system. And also, even complicated things like putting a person on the moon, it's still not a systemic complex issue. It's complicated. Obviously, building a rocket is very complicated, and it involves a lot of different elements. But complex is something like raising a child, where no child is the same as the other. The outcomes are uncertain. The environment in which the child is growing, events can affect. The relationship between what you do and outcomes is very uncertain. And the needs, you discover the needs of the child as you go on. The child, of course, is reacting and growing and changing as a result of what you do as well. So it's a very complex system. So obviously, on the basis of this, people who bring up children should get much more rewarded than people who put rockets into space. That doesn't quite happen, as we know. So in these areas, you really need, if you've got a complex problem, you really need to be able to think about the whole system. So what is system thinking? Well, this is a very simple little diagram that, so traditional thinking is just thinking about how one thing affects another. And you think, well, why would you ever do that? But actually, that has been the classic natural science approach, to remove all other, make ceteris paribus, everything else equal, and try and work out how one specific thing affects another. And this has been the scientific method for hundreds of years, and has obviously achieved many things. But obviously, if you don't think, ceteris paribus in the real world, other things are not equal. And this is what systems thinking is about, that things affect other things, which affect other things, and events and external happenings, and everything disturbs the system. And of course, that doesn't give you the clear-cut sort of answers that natural science offers, but it gives you more realism, more understanding. So how do you do system thinking? Well, there's various ways. You can think of a pattern, try to think about the problem, how it relates to different elements. This is one sort of way of structuring it. What's the problem? Why is it a problem? What's it linked to? What's causing it? When is it a problem? How does it appear? Where is it a problem? What are the particular elements? What is causing it? And who is the problem for? Who's affected? And you can develop these sorts of pictures that try and link all these different elements up. And these diagrams can become very elaborate. And actually, if you ever go and see one of these maps of linkages after the event, when people have got together to try and map out the linkages in a system, it's very difficult to tell what is going on. Actually, you almost have to be there to get anything out of it. I think these are the sorts of tools, you thinking about what's connected, what's not connected, what's linear, what are the feedback loops, silos, what are not interacting, whereas what is emergence? Emergence is a core sort of concept in complex systems, that out of lots of small micro interactions, a macro system emerges. And actually, in a way, we have emerged from huge numbers of interactions at a micro scale within us. And it will be very difficult if you look at the individual chemicals in our body and how they interact, to predict that that is a human emerges made up of all those interactions would be impossible, really, for looking at that level. And you can look at lots of other systems where you look at just the micro, but to predict the macro patterns that you get is potentially, well, largely, or impossible, very difficult to do, except with maybe some modeling that allows actually emergence to happen. But the initial conditions, the resulting, if you get the initial conditions wrong or the detail wrong, you'll maybe get a totally different emergence. Thinking of parts and wholes and linkages, analysis versus synthesis. These are all just broad sort of ways of trying to tease out the different elements of a system. I think actually this is a very useful framing, because the thing is, to understand the system, it's not just what you see. So in the system, obviously you see events happening, you see patterns of responses. So you can see in the pandemic, for instance, we've got an event, which is outbreaks, a virus, and you can see patterns of response and different patterns in different places. So you can see in some countries a pattern of very quick reaction, control, and suppression of the virus, and you can see patterns in other countries where there hasn't been. The immediate reaction was that, well, it's not that bad, and let's leave it because it will disturb the economy if we do something dramatic. And then we've got patterns of substantial outbreaks, sometimes not even different waves, but a wave that's continuing, patterns of high levels of deaths and so forth. So you can see all the different patterns. But what you maybe can't see, or is not so obvious and lies under this is an iceberg, if you like, underwater, if you like, is the systemic structures that are driving those patterns. Because if you just look at the patterns themselves, it's not clear why that's happening. Why did one country make, government make immediate decisions and others not? And you can then look at the systemic structures, institutions, relationships, who's linked to who. So, I mean, you can look at obviously the US and see systemic structures in terms of the relationships between the president and the other houses and state governments. You can see the relationship between those and the health services and so on. And then the mental models. So the mental models of people thought, well, if we tackle the virus, that'll undercut economic activity, and we believe economic activity is essential for growth, for the good of the country. And so people being very sort of reluctant to actually take action, but also the mental models of it'll sort of go away, sort of optimism that it can't be that bad, that we saw as well. So you can see various sort of mental models that have driven, and maybe those have been the key things. So trying to understand the complex set of events that are happening at the moment that you can sort of see involves getting below into the deeper levels. But this is, I think, the fundamental thing to remember. You are not God. Quite often, people who say they're system thinkers see system thinking as solving a very complicated puzzle. But they've forgotten that word. That's complicated. You can solve a complicated puzzle, but a complex problem or a complex puzzle only sort of you'd have to see absolutely everything and how everything interrelates to understand it. So ultimately, it's not comprehensible by one person or even a number of people. So one of the key things I'd say is system thinking is not saying the puzzle is even more complicated, we've got to go and study and research, etc. Actually, because by the time you've got understood anything about the past, the future's changed anyway. The system's moved on, other things have happened, and everything you may have learned is no longer relevant. So you have to approach this, I would say, in a very different manner. Obviously, you can begin to identify the structures, some of the linkages, and start trying to figure out the system to some extent, but you'll never totally crack it. And that's the nature of a complex system. So if you're into changing systems, you can't wait in typical sort of research manner to spend your life trying to understand it, because you'll never understand your life and you'll never actually ever do anything. So you have to be trying to understand a certain amount and also acting. And a key element here, I would suggest, is collective action and intelligence. You need different perspectives, because different people in different parts of the system will have different understandings of how the system works, different views on it. And actually, by bringing those together, you have a far better chance of trying to understand what is going on. Of course, and also by bringing people together, you then get a coalition of people who are trying to change the system. And here, the key is to focus on the why. And so often people are focused on the what and how, what they're going to do about it, what the solution, how they're going to do solutions. But actually, the fundamental why, and by that I mean, why does this matter? What is the problem? And I suppose here I'd say, like the example of in economics, it's totally dominated by a very narrow way of thinking. And that is a problem, because it stops us innovating and reorganizing ourselves to address the huge problems that we're facing, the huge crises, the ecological crisis, social fragmentation, and so forth. And that why is what can bind a group together with different sets of knowledge, a diverse group who then work together. But the question is, well, where should, in this huge system of all the people who you might work with, where do you go? And I suppose the key message I would suggest is go where the energy is. And that doesn't mean that some people are, actually, as this picture suggests, lazy or just not interested. But what it really means is that there are somewhere where there's potential, where people see opportunity. And that might be just because of their situation, their resources, an opportunity for change. There's a particular, say, law that's being reviewed. There's new policy initiatives that could be different. There's linkages you could make. So we are looking to promote institutional innovation to manage complex systems. And I was talking to someone at the Waste Resources Action Program, WRAP, about seeing if we could apply institutional innovation, changing institutions to the circular economy. And the guy there, senior guy, was very interested in the idea. And we were thinking, well, where might we do it? Where could we have a pilot? Where could we bring people together who saw the opportunity and might do something that then created a story that then spread? And so we identified, for instance, that in Greenwich, IKEA were working with communities around furniture, restoration, repurposing, rebuilding. And IKEA were very motivated. They had an ambitious target to promote a circular economy in furniture. They're also highly influential, highly significant. And to date, I know that they failed. They've tried a partnership with a refurbishment organization, and it's failed. So they're on the lookout for some other solutions. And in Greenwich, where they have space, they have a refurbishment space. It's also a space where I know someone who is chief executive of the Greenwich Cooperative Development Agency, who is also a senior advisor to the Mayor of London. So getting her involved, getting IKEA involved, having the links already in place with the communities that IKEA have been working with, and a motivation provides a potential for energy to do something that then gets more profile and creates change. And the key there is that the why, the need for a circular economy to minimize environmental impacts, will all be something that brings all these people together so that they're willing to work through. We don't know quite what the answer is. We don't know how it will quite work, but getting people all in the same place who see the potential to do something in the relatively short term to create change, that is the start of change in a complex system. Because all those different people bringing together will bring some knowledge, possibility, perspectives to understanding the system and wanting to act. So that is my take on systems thinking. And it's interesting, you know, Dave and I had a chat about it earlier, and he was more on the try and understand the system and find a service or interaction in that system. And I think it's a bit both and it depends what you're going to do. If you are producing a product maybe or a service, you're more commercially oriented, then the whole point is you're trying to look at the system as is and trying to see what might work with it, how you might make money out of it. On the other end of the scale, if you're trying to change the system, you're thinking more about how the system ought to be. And so you're trying to think about system change, and that is even more complex in terms of thinking how it might change. You're thinking about a vision of a different sort of world and so on. So that more flexible, collaborating, learning, developing, adapting sort of approach, you're not so worried about capturing value. You're spreading your ideas, you're trying to build a coalition and so on. Less of the, you need to understand a certain amount of system, what the key institutions are, mental models, events, trends. You still need those sorts of understanding, but you need to act, to connect, to learn, to spread change. So I will now, I'm going to close my screen and then I will take some questions. Please do use the Q&A. I'll just check the chat. And I'm going to look at the Q&A. So any questions, and I'll certainly look to bring some people onto stage, so I'm not all alone up here. Is this take on system thinking gel with you, or would you think add anything, subtract anything? Right, Adam, what about making a difference where it feels like the energy isn't like rural communities, which I'm based in? Well, you have to go where the energy is. That can be online. It could be in different rural communities. There may be, I mean, energy is often generated, I'd say, where there's a problem. I think where there are problems, there are opportunities. And people might not realize, or might not, that this is a complex situation and that you may have some solutions or you can help with them, but they'll certainly understand the problem. And obviously in rural communities, there are a lot of major problems. They're facing a sort of post-Brexit future. They probably are trying to think how to deal with the new environmental land management scheme. They know they've got problems of pollution. They know they need to collaborate. I know, Adam, you're interested in models of collaboration. Well, certainly there are problems. So energy is, I would say, more generated by a problem. Fear of loss is a huge motivator, whereas an opportunity is something, well, you could do it next year. It's possible. It sounds like a nice idea, but it's something that can be put off. So find where the problems are in your community and where your ideas might link to them, and there you'll find, I think, energy. Tom, thanks. Is your Greenwich example an illustration of the highly conservative nature of some systems thinking, relying on large corporate alliances or networks to promote collective dialogue or action? Well, interestingly, I don't know about relying on large corporate alliances, but certainly if you've got a large corporate that you think is seriously motivated around change, then that can be a powerful alliance, but not alone. obviously the key is to have other alliances that ensure that the whole change is trying to end up for public purpose. So I wouldn't say that alliances with corporates, depending on their motivation and their culture. So I think IKEA, as far as I understand, is a sort of purpose-driven organization. Now, it still seeks to make money, and I suppose the test is in the eating, but trying to bring on these large corporations, they can create a lot of change. Now, of course, they can be very dangerous as well. So how you manage them and make sure that you've got other powers at your source. And the idea is actually to create innovative institutions that actually ensure that they can't dominate. And that is part of the innovation. If they don't accept that, then you move on and find people who might accept that. But that is part of the story, that you're trying to build on their sense of trying to make positive, public-orientated change, being highly aware of the risks involved and bringing countervailing forces to ensure that you keep to public purpose. System thinking seems to look a lot like mind mapping. Is there a difference? What is it? Well, interestingly, because who suggested the mind mapping? Because you might, if you're a mentor, you can switch on your microphone and camera and come on board, because I'm not so familiar with mind mapping, and maybe you can tell us more about it and we can discuss what the differences may or may not be. If it's trying to show linkages between different things, then it's probably similar. I mean, yeah. Come and tell me if you have. Others might be able to inform me as well. Thinking more systemically might help us find more effective ways of reducing the diverse inequalities that are wrecking our economies. What are the institutional other barriers preventing this? Well, that is a huge question, and I suppose you'd have to look at the particular inequalities that you're considering. There are no general answers, I would say, in this area. Having said that, the only general answer I might suggest is in how we structure our economies, with the dominance of corporates who are seeking to maximize their returns to shareholders, who tend to be obviously the better off, and therefore you get a reinforcement of inequality, which we've seen as more and more resources over the last 30, 40 years have gone to capital rather than labor, for instance. So there is something, but then you'd have to look, well, how do you change that? You've got to find some particular circumstances where you can make change and so forth. So spotting general patterns and so forth is useful, but you've got to get into specific instances of how that might change or how you can make that change. With a complex issue, do you think it's better to simplify the message to get more people on board, or is there a danger of oversimplifying complex problems? Well, I think the why in a complex issue can be quite simple, and actually has to be in a way. What is the fundamental problem that the set of people who are going to want to work together to solve the problem? What is it? How do you describe it? And I think describing that, substantial huge inequality causing damage in such and such a situation, that is something that could unify people to tackle that. Of course, what you do as a result of that could be much more complex in terms of how you respond, what actions you take. And the core group probably need to understand that and that thinking and generate that collectively, relying on lots of input and different ideas and different knowledge. So that is the sort of complex businesses deciding, so what should you do? In terms of what you do, trying to explain that action and what its benefits could be, that probably needs to be relatively a simple story about why the action, the collaboration, or whatever it is that you're planning to do, why that has a positive impact. That again can be a relatively simple story, I think. Paula, how to break down the preconceptions of cleanliness or high social class that the use of plastic has? I don't know. That's certainly a complex problem, I'd suggest. I mean, I think the importance of cleanliness is actually also sort of pride, which is also linking to working class, actually. My experience, actually, high social class are more tolerant of mess and chaos because they have other things that they can rely on to give them high social, give them status. So it depends what your source of status is. So that's that is a complex issue. I'm not sure if I can answer that. What I'm trying to look at here is more, how do you think about complex problems rather than trying to solve them? Though illustrations are quite useful. So I mean, I think you'd have to look at all the different uses of plastic and what is driving it, because preservation, the low weight, convenience, all these things to try and address the plastics issue. And I have to admit, I haven't tried to think about the plastics issue myself, so I can't really add that. Mike, one of the tools that's used to make things visual mind mapping, rich picture process flows. It's the cognitive thing that we understand more if it's visual. I'll tell you what, Mike, can you switch on your microphone and camera and join me?
Thanks.
That's
a rather than the real life is. There you go. Right.
Yes. Thanks, Mike. So is it just the fact that visualizing things, mapping things is a useful technique for understanding, or is there because presumably you can mind map something that's quite simple, can you? So is it directly related?
Yes, I can go into various levels of detail on this, and we'd still be here at tea time, so I won't go into that level. But yeah,
what do people have to know if you were going to do system thinking?
Yep.
How would mind mapping help you, or what is it different? Is it a particular technique of mapping a system?
It would help you, because if you can get something on a side of A4 paper, or on a great big wall on the wall of a room or something like that, what you can do is you can take a step back and look at the side of A4 paper, and you can say, I understand this. If you then want to get into more detail, you can map it at a tier below. So many years ago, the person who taught me why this was important said, it's actually very simple. If you look at, if you're putting a new nuclear power station in place, it's 3 steps. You design nuclear power station, you build nuclear power station, and you commission, as in turn on, nuclear power station. If you've got that, you can see how you could have that as kind of, three steps in the whole process. And you and I could look at that and we could go, okay, I understand about building a nuclear power station. Clearly, if you're going to actually, hand that to the guys who are using the diggers on the ground and pouring the concrete, it's not a lot of use to them. So you can tier that, and you can go further down with it.
But that's a complicated problem. That's not a complex problem, is it?
But the same applies in any of the others as well. So the mind map stuff, I've just done some stuff in terms of stakeholders. And people were sitting around a table and talking and chatting and telling me all these complicated bits and pieces and all these complex bits and pieces. You draw the mind map of how they all tie together, and you can have a picture.
For me, that's just a map. What's the mind? What does the mind bit add? I mean, it's a diagram, isn't it? I mean, what?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
It's a diagram.
Yeah, but the key thing behind any of them is that what you do is you make it visual. Mm-hmm. If you make it visual cognitively, that bit about we sit and take things in visually. So if you and I are standing and we're looking around a piece of paper that's got a diagram on it like that,
Yeah.
you and I can point at things on that and we can have a chat. If you and I are sitting around a boardroom table and we're trying to hold what we're saying in our heads, and we start doing the kind of the formal boardroom behavior, it's a very different kind of way of working together. What that then allows you to do is to put the kind of the data on it and to do the kind of the problem solving stuff, because it highlights where the issues are. So you work through that kind of stuff. But I will pause, Henry, because you're trying to come in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think no, that's all makes a lot of sense. Interesting, I always find that when I come into a room, which I said earlier, when someone has been doing a mapping process and put something big on the wall with lots of arrows and things linked together, and I go and try and look at it to try and work out, well, what does it mean? I find it absolutely incomprehensible. And I think with these things, you do have to be there and be part of the developing process. And there is a tendency of people in group to add more and more links and arrows and so on. So I think the group then has to think about what are the key bits of their story and really, really simplify to communicate to people who actually were not there.
And that's the nested bit about, you can do the nuclear power station in 3 steps, but you nest it further down, you get 9 steps, 12 steps further down, you get 36 and so forth.
That is a complicated problem. So you can sort of do that, whereas in a complex problem, you've got all sorts of feedback loops and links, and I mean, you probably have to some extent got in a project, you've got various dependencies and so forth, but it's still complicated as opposed to complex, isn't it?
You can do it on complex as well. It's
well, the complex bit, if you bring all of society in and the planning and the politics and the fact that it may never be built, and that suddenly we may decide we don't want Chinese to build power stations and all that sort of stuff. But the actual building the thing itself,
I think it's online at the moment. So Cranfield did some stuff about 3-4 weeks ago, where Stephen, whose surname escapes me, did some stuff about the difference between complex and complicated. And he used the example, the guy who landed the plane on the Hudson River and all that kind of stuff. So there's a kind of an hour-long video, which I think is probably more widely open.
Well,
of him take
chat. If you
sorry, say again.
Do post it in the chat.
Yeah, I'll have to look in terms of whether you needed to be part of the group to do it. But yeah, if it's I'll check if I can. Yeah, no problem.
So that, and what did he decide that was complex or complicated?
There's a whole host of stuff. The bit about complicated is basically, as you describe the rocket, is repeating the same thing time and time again. So it's complicated, and lots of Heath Robinson diagrams are complicated, but they're not complex.
Yeah.
Complex is the bit about where you're dealing with lots of those kind of different variables. You've got the emergent stuff coming through and so forth. And so, and so it's then kind of tied into the behaviors of how the pilot worked with that, how the organization dealt with it. And that whole kind of thing about in those cases, the individual was then taken to a tribunal. And the reason for that is because it's actually easier for you to blame an individual as opposed to blaming the system, because you then have to take the wider approach. And there's, I will pause, because otherwise I shall go off.
Once you bring people in, things can get complex.
Yeah, but going back to the kind of where this started, the whole bit about the visual stuff is what that allows you to do is for people to focus on the issue. So irrespective of what the issue is, because it'll have aspects of all different kinds of things. So actually, you've got a whole set of things that allow tools and techniques developed over the years that allow you to use the far more creative thing, which is none of these tools, but the human brain focused in a particular way. And once you see that happening, as opposed to the kind of the boardroom behaviors or the kind of line management, hierarchical command and control stuff, it's very, very different. And it goes back to what they've developed over the past kind of 70 years or so, is all these kind of things that deal with human behavior. So you talked about people getting sort of grouped together. Whether you call that handover in terms of a nurse's shift, whether you call that start of shift briefing, whether those of us who remember Hill Street Blues, it's the bit where the guy at the start of it, they are very different kind of styles, but actually they're all the same thing, which is how do I get this group of people to focus on what we need to do for the next day, the next 3 hours, or whatever. And again, there are a whole host of things that have been developed to make those focused and constructive. So, and that's the key bit with it. The reason it works is because if you look at it as how it ties into human behavior and cognitive stuff, as opposed to, and apologies to the engineers here, as opposed to purely focusing on the kind of, the engineers and the kind of, the very tight tolerances and all that kind of stuff, then that's how you can apply it to much broader kind of sets of the world, in terms of, either the service stuff or some of the things you're talking about, or some of the research stuff, and a whole host of stuff.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much, Mike.
Cheers.
Yes, it's interesting. It's a tool, but as Tom said, I think that's a good point. It depends what the map is for. And quite often you might need to do many different maps because you have different groups at different times who are trying to get together. And I suppose ownership of the map. There's a difference between, I think, a map that people produce for other people and a map that is collectively developed for a group for their purposes. Which can obviously be a lot more complex and so on. So thinking about that, and if you're bringing some new people in or trying to work with some new people, you probably need to redraw the map because you've got a new group and you need to develop a new understanding. So absolutely, there's not one map to rule them all. Remember, that's the God thing. Any other questions? Anyone got some examples of systems thinking that and system change that they've done that that illustrate this sort of systems thinking that they'd like to talk about? Or what about, I mean, someone who's talking about a particular issue at this moment? I know, Chloe, you're looking at vaccinations. I don't know if you thought about want to talk about the vaccination challenge. Let's have actually, it's quite an interesting system, which I think everyone will be aware of. Actually, we've got a Q&A thing. I'll just pick that up. Could you briefly describe boundary judgments? Okay, let's, Chloe, I think you've now challenged me and I'm going to bring you up. I hope that's okay. And let's discuss that. I'm just trying, I'm just having a technical problem. I can't see how to get, okay, here we go. Let's have a discussion. I think the question of boundary is very interesting.
Hi.
Hi, Chloe. Good morning. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. How are you?
Good, good. So what were you asked this question about boundary judgments. What were you thinking of?
In terms of kind of how do you define what's in a system? So one person might see different things within one system than a different person, and kind of define.
Let's apply it, because it's very difficult to address these sorts of questions theoretically, if you like. So maybe let's just quickly say, what's the issue that you're trying to think about with your group, and what sort of boundary issues do you think are there?
I don't think we've 100% decided, but I know we were talking about vaccinations the last few sessions,
Right.
and we were kind of looking at equal distribution, but we've kind of taken that further to look at kind of the process of deciding like a hierarchy of who gets vaccines. So I guess the judgment would be deciding who is important within, first of all, defining who there is to even consider, and then I guess who.
And you're thinking, what you're thinking of what how someone who would decide, as opposed to, are you thinking about what you might do about it? Or because I thought there was some suggestion you might look at sort of social media to encourage young people to get vaccinated and counter the sort of anti-vax messages.
Yeah, we can look at that as well. I think we haven't completely decided on anything yet. It's just we've discussed them in general.
Okay, well, I would suggest to focus on something that you could do or get someone to do or something, because rather than developing a sort of theory of what the answer is, if you see what I mean, because the thing is that you might come up with the answer, but no one will agree with you. But I think that in this sort of space, boundary issues are really interesting, because you'd imagine that the people who are least likely to get vaccinations in poorer countries and so on, the least powerful, because the powerful will seek to get vaccinations, won't they? And the least powerful. And the thing is about less powerful people is that they tend to have lots of other issues that they're facing, obviously, because of the limited power they have means that they're struggling on huge number of fronts.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about how you might help them or ensure they get access to vaccines, you have to then think about the whole system in which they live, survive, and the challenges they have and what their priorities are. So, and it's interesting there is a big question, about the boundary, because, most NGOs who are working with these sorts of communities take a very holistic approach. So, because they have to, because obviously if they just came in with a solution, hi, I've got a vaccine, they might turn around, people will turn around and say, well, that's not what matters to us.
Yeah.
So there, I mean, that seems to be an area that you couldn't avoid bringing into thinking about things. If you're thinking about the sort of countering anti-vax messages to young people, so more, it's like at the moment, there's this campaign at the moment, don't kill your granny, which is the most blunt to tell, lazy. Now that is a classic example where the counter to that has been sort of articles about saying, well, things are much more complicated. Young people have various pressures. They can be quite responsible, but they think actually this, is a low risk, et cetera, et cetera. And anyway, the advice is quite confusing. But you would have to think about all the issues young people face and pressures and so on, and what would work with them, because they might really I would imagine as a young person, I'd be really resented to tell not to kill my granny. Well, clearly, come on, who do you think I am? So there's an action and reaction that might be counterproductive as a message to young people, because they might just feel insulted. So, you're thinking about, when you're thinking about a problem, you can see what might come into the system. Now, a boundary, the fact that I'm trying to think what would not be in the system, what you might not need to think about, but it might be, pensions for young people. There's lots of things that affect young people, which probably are outside the consideration of how you encourage them to get vaccinated. So it's trying to think about the problem and the issues and the connections and the things that you see having links and affecting it have to be in. So it's a pragmatic question, and different people will have different views as to what might affect things, obviously. So there's you don't say, I'm just going to think about this, I'm going to set boundaries, because actually deciding on the boundaries is what trying to think about the system is. Exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You will have seen, by the way, we've put out, you should have received an email about the sort of next steps following your very useful feedback, which was very, very much appreciated. Okay, I'm going to, unless you've got any other comments or questions, I'll see if I can get rid of you. Yeah, brilliant. Any other questions? We can have, it's 8:55. Yeah, so we could break now unless any other questions for 5 minutes, and then we'll start the workshop, which will give us slightly more time anyway. Okay, I will switch off the present. Thank you very much, everyone. And you'll see I've got the questions up on the agenda that we're going to start discussing next. So I'll give an intro and come back in 5 minutes. Look forward to talking then. Okay, cheers.